Welcome to the podcast for Renaissance Fellowship, where we are creatively and actively revealing Jesus' love to our generation. Here we find the script in Scripture and the text in context. Follow us at redandfellowship.com or join us live Sunday nights at 6 p.m. in Sunrise, Florida, or online via Periscope. Here's our pastor, Jerrod Cring.
Know your enemy. Knowing truly who your enemy is in life can be really challenging. It can be really difficult to know who your enemy is. In the 21st century America, anybody who disagrees with us is our enemy, right? If you disagree with me, well, then you must be my enemy. Anyone who dares to disagree is not our friend anymore, right? Friendship, the litmus test for friendship is how much we agree with each other. The minute you disagree with me, well, unfriend, unfollow, avoid at all costs, right? That's the American way. 2016, can we even imagine how many people were unfriended in 2016? Oh my gosh, just the political posts alone, you'd be like, unfriend, boom, unfollow, boom. So we become fixated on this idea of whether we agree with people on every little thing, every little political, moral, social issue, that we have no idea who our real enemy is. Now, this will come as no shock to anyone who knows me or has known me for more than 5 minutes, but I like movies. How many people knew that? Yes. Yeah, okay. Now, I really enjoy going to the movies. I'm a movie buff. Movies and music, that's kind of my thing. And one of the things I love most in a movie is a good plot twist. Who loves it? A really good plot twist. Now, I'm picky about my plot twists. It can't just be any change the plot for no reason just to be crazy. No. Okay, for two things. Number one, it's got to be plausible, right? It's got to make sense. The twist has got to make sense. They can't cheat. It's got to make sense with what's been going on. And second, it can't be predictable. You can't see it coming, otherwise it's not really a plot twist, right? Okay, so one of the most powerful things that you can have in a movie, one of the most powerful plot twists, and it's in so many classic movies, is a betrayal, right? A good betrayal goes a long way in a movie. Okay, for example, think about Fredo in The Godfather Part 2, right? Anybody ever seen Godfather Part 2? Okay, one of the best. Fredo betrays Michael. You broke my heart, Fredo, right? And he kisses him. It's heart-wrenching, right? Okay, what about Cypher in The Matrix? Right? Oh, just so bad, okay? Braveheart's one of my favorite movies, right? So Robert the Bruce and how he betrays William Wallace in Braveheart, right? Just when he takes the helmet off and you see it was Robert, and you're like, no, not Robert the Bruce, right? Or, of course, Lando Calrissian, right? Okay, no, I know. People are going to be like, oh, Jerrod, he's not really a villain. He was just forced to do... No. Han Solo was frozen in carbonite because Lando Calrissian betrayed him. So just because he turned around later does not mean that it was not a betrayal. Did I go a little too far into the nerd category there? Just was it carbonite that threw it off? Was it frozen? Was that where I went too far? Okay. I got to know where the nerd line is, because sometimes I step way over the nerd line. Okay. But here's the thing. Do you remember the first time you saw Empire Strikes Back? And the doors opened and Darth Vader was at the end of the table and you were like, my heart almost just leapt out of my chest. I couldn't believe it. I was like, no, Lando, no. You're supposed to be Han's friend. I'm sorry. I digress. But I believe that one of the reasons that all of these betrayals, they resonate so deeply with us is because they're all kind of these metaphors for the story of Jesus and the betrayal that we see of Judas betraying Jesus, this close compatriot, this person that was supposed to be a brother in arms, and how he betrayed Jesus. So it's kind of like this metaphor for it. But I'll tell you something really interesting. You want something interesting? All of these betrayals, we fixate on the person who betrayed, right? As the villain. But in every single one of these, the betrayer was just a pawn for the real evil and the real plot that was behind the scenes, right? Okay, walk with me. Think about The Godfather Part 2, Fredo. Fredo wasn't the real villain. Hyman Roth was the real villain. He was the one planning everything. That guy was the real villain. I know I'm getting some deep movie knowledge here. Spoilers all over the place here. Major spoiler alert, okay? How about Cypher in The Matrix? Cypher wasn't the real villain. The Matrix was the villain. Smith, Agent Smith, he was the real villain, right? Robert the Bruce in Braveheart, he wasn't the villain. He was just a puppet of his father and Edward the Longshanks. Remember that guy? He's evil. That's the evil guy. And of course, Lando Calrissian, he wasn't a villain. It was Darth Vader and the Emperor. That was the real evil behind the scenes, right? And the same, now this is where it gets weird. The same is true with Jesus. We get fixated on Judas and 30 pieces of silver, Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate washing his hands of the blood. But who was the real villain behind the scenes? Who was the puppet master pulling the strings? And here's the funny thing, this is really interesting, and I'll guarantee you this. Jesus knew who his real enemy was. Jesus knew exactly who was behind the scenes and what he was doing. Now, tonight we're in part 2 of a series called Finale. And what we've been talking about and as we're leading up to these weeks towards Easter, we're looking at the final 7 days of Jesus' life. Jesus' grand finale. And how he was able to finish so strong. How he was able to take his life and bring it to completion in such a perfect and powerful way. And how we as human beings, how we want to do that same thing too. Not just overall in our lives, but every day to be able to finish strong with our relationships, with our work, with everything that we do to be able to finish strong. Now, last week we looked at what was called the triumphal entry. This is where Jesus comes into Jerusalem. There's palm trees waving, and they lay their coats down for him like he's a conquering king entering the city, but he comes into Jerusalem not exactly the way people expected. They were expecting their Messiah to come in on a big white horse with a sword drawn like a conquering warrior king and to vanquish the Romans and put the Israelites back on the throne of the people of God and in the high place that they were supposed to be. But here comes Jesus riding in on a colt, a little baby donkey, full-grown man on a little baby donkey, defying their expectations. Flying in the face of what they thought they needed. And we learned last week that God doesn't give us what we expect. He gives us what we need. God doesn't give us what we expect. He gives us what we need. And immediately upon entrance into the city of Jerusalem, the religious system, the leaders begin to complain about the noise, complain about the disciples. And we also learned that last week that Jesus will always stand up for people in the face of tradition and religion. If you want to know what side Jesus will be on, he'll be on the side with people and individuals over tradition, religion, and propriety. Jesus will always stand with people. See, the triumph in this what's called the triumphal entry was not that Jesus entered into Jerusalem as a king. It's not that people praised. The triumph was that mankind finally got what we needed instead of what we expected. You see, because the people expected a king, but what they needed was a servant. The people expected war with the Romans, but what they needed was forgiveness. The people expected strength, but what they needed was love, a servant of forgiveness and love. We, still today, we want power, kings. We want war, battles, and we want strength. But even today, what do we need? We need a servant with forgiveness and love. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to keep going now, right through this week of Jesus' life. So he comes into Jerusalem on this little baby donkey. I don't know what that sound effect is, but it goes with the donkey. He comes into Jerusalem, and the first thing that he does is he goes to the temple, where he has a confrontation with the Pharisees. Now remember last week we said whenever you hear the word Pharisees, you've got to say, boo. Okay, whenever I say Pharisees, you say, boo. Excellent. Okay. And he immediately goes to the temple, and this is where we're going to pick up in Mark the 11th chapter. It's going to be verse number 15. If you have your Bible or your device, you can read along. If not, it's going to be on the screens, and you can read it, and I'll read it for you. Mark 11, verse 15, and it says, "And when they came to Jerusalem, he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and to say to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of thieves.'" Verse 18, very important. "The chief priests and scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him. For they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching." Wow. I mean, this image of Jesus flipping over the tables, anarchy in the UK, just going crazy, right? This is one of the most iconic, most legendary images of Jesus. We love this one. This is the anti-establishment Jesus, punk rock Jesus is what this is, right? We love this. But it happens so fast that it leaves us with some really serious questions. Why did he do this? I mean, was Jesus against business? Was Jesus against money? Was he a communist? Was this a statement against commerce? Did Jesus lose control in a rage? And this is where we always talk about the script in Scripture, right? Knowing your character, your main character. Because if you don't know your main character, then you won't necessarily know what he'll do and what he won't do, right? So when someone says, "Oh, Jesus, I guess he just went off in a rage and he did these things," because we have this visual image of Jesus walking in and seeing the money changers and like him going all Incredible Hulk, right? And seeing all this and going, "Rrr," and like flipping over the tables, "This is not acceptable," just slamming around. That's the way we see it. Like he just flew off the handle when he saw all this happening in the God's temple and he couldn't stand it and he just went crazy. Does that sound like Jesus? No, I don't think that sounds like him. That doesn't sound like him. And also, if that's not in his character, then there must be something else going on, right? There must be some other purpose behind what he does. If it's not in his character to flip out, then there must be some other motivation driving his actions. So here's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to unpack this moment in history. And we're going to show you some stuff that you may not have known that's really pretty interesting. There's going to be some intrigue. There's going to be some scandal. And it's going to be pretty deep. And it's going to be really, really fun. And you're going to hear the rest of the story. Anybody remember Paul Harvey? Yeah, the rest of the story. And he would do like this radio show and tell you this whole story about someone. And then you get to the end and find out who it was. And you'd be like, "What? That was Abraham Lincoln? What?" I don't know why it always seemed like it was Abraham Lincoln. But it was, and he'd tell you the rest of the story and all these details. And that's what we're going to do tonight with this cleansing of the temple, which is what it's known as. We're going to pick this up in John, the 2nd chapter. And verse number 13, and I want to read this to you. Listen to this. "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And those who were selling the doves, he said, 'Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business.'" Now, at first glance, this is pretty familiar, right? It sounds a lot like what we just read in Mark the 11th chapter, right? Because all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all have this cleansing of the temple. Now, in Mark, it happens in the 11th chapter, in the last week of Jesus' life. In Matthew, it happens in the 21st chapter, in the last week of Jesus' life. In Luke, it happens in the 19th chapter, in the last week of his life. But in John, it's in the 2nd chapter. It's kind of weird, right? And right before this, Jesus has just turned water into wine in Cana. It's his first public miracle. And here the next thing we see is him going into the temple and cleansing the temple. So what is this? Is this inconsistency? Is John wrong? Is he misremembering? Why is this at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? Here's something interesting. Almost all biblical scholars agree that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. Did you know that? He cleansed the temple twice. Once at the beginning of his ministry, and 3 years later, in the last week of his life, at the end of his ministry. Now that just changes the perspective on the whole thing, right? Because you might do something once out of a moment of passion, but you come back and do it a second time, the exact same thing? No. That means he was making a point, right? That means that this is really, really important that we understand the script in Scripture and the text in context, because there are a couple of things that I want you to notice about these two individual events because they're different. Okay, they're very different. Okay, the first thing I want you to notice is in John the 2nd chapter, the one we just read, it says that Jesus, in verse 15, it says that he made a scourge of cords. That means he made a whip. Now, here's the thing. We get this image, right, that Jesus was the rage monster, the Incredible Hulk. You know, he just comes in, he's so angry, and he reaches down and he grabs something, he just starts whipping people. But no, he made the whip. So that is not a moment of passion. That is a moment of intent. He's sitting there, get these jokers, making this scourge of cords. It is a moment of intention. Because he makes the whip. Now, the other thing that I want you to see is that Jesus says, you have turned my Father's house into a place of business, a place of commerce, okay? Again, text and context. Here's what you got to understand. Jesus is coming to Jerusalem at the very beginning of his ministry. He's just done his first public miracle in Cana, and he comes for Passover. Nobody knows who he is. He's just some guy from the hills of Galilee who comes in the temple and starts flipping over tables. The first question they ask him after he does it is, by what authority do you do this? Who do you think you are? They have no idea who he is. But now, fast forward 3 years later, they know who he is. He's turned the entire country upside down with the word of his miracles, his teachings, his confrontations with the religious system. He is a known troublemaker, if you will. And he comes in and he does the exact same thing that he did 3 years earlier that caused so much controversy. But there's a little bit of a difference. The first time he said they turned his Father's house into a place of business. The second time he says they turned it into a den of thieves. A little different there, wouldn't you say? I don't think I'm picking at pins here to say it's a little different to call something a place of business and then to turn around and call it a den of thieves, right? That's kind of a big difference, I would think. And then immediately after he calls it the den of thieves, verse 18 in Mark 11 says, and the chief priests and the scribes heard this, and they began seeking how to destroy him. That's intense. Destroy him. But they were afraid of him. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Now, a couple things we need to understand. Let's get this, because we keep using this term money changers, and I have all these animals, and it's like, what are money changers? Like, let's get clear. Okay, this was the temple, and people came to the temple, especially at Passover, to give an offering. They would bring money, and they would bring an animal to sacrifice. Okay, now when they brought money at the time, the country was occupied by Rome, so they were using Roman money. Well, guess what was on the Roman money? Caesar. There was an image of Caesar. And according to the second commandment, you're not supposed to make any graven images. So the people couldn't come and bring their offering, and in the process of bringing their offering, commit a sin by having a graven image, right? So what they would do is they would bring their Roman money and exchange that money for money that didn't have anything on it, okay? Also, people didn't want to have to travel with their animals. You know, it's kind of inconvenient. They didn't want to have to do that. So they go to the temple and they just buy an animal there to sacrifice, right? I mean, gotcha. Got everything you need. One-stop shopping. Money changers. We got some doves for you. Everything's simple. But of course, if it's convenient, it's not really a sacrifice, is it? That's another message. We'll come back to that some other time. But Jesus knows what's going on here. He understands the money changers. He understands what's happening. And he understands what their purpose is. Now, there were two major places in Jerusalem where you could do this exchange. There was a set of booths at the base of the Mount of Olives outside the city. So while you're on your way to the city, hey, we're going to stop, pick up a couple of animals, and exchange our money before we get into town. And then there was a place inside the walls of the temple in the outer court where you could do the same thing. Now, these booths had a name. Did you know that? Historical record tells us that these booths were called the booths of Annas. Now, who was Annas? Because this is relatively important. If Jesus is flipping over his tables, it might be kind of important who he was. Now, Annas, somewhere around between 6 and 8 AD, the Romans decided that the Jewish people could no longer select their own high priest. Okay? Now, the high priest was a really important job. Super, like top tier, most important job in the Judaism. He was the guy that during Passover took the animal sacrifice into the Holy of Holies and sacrificed it for the sins of the entire nation. One guy, big job, most important job, head honcho, big enchilada, big kahuna, high priest. The Romans looked and said, whoa, that's a pretty high profile job. We don't want that job falling into the wrong hands of maybe somebody who would be subversive or maybe have some weird political views. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to pick the high priest. So in somewhere between 6 and 8 AD, they picked this guy, Annas, to be that year's high priest. Now, Annas wasn't no fool. And he took this job of high priest, and not only did he hold on to it for a while, but he also turned it into a family enterprise. I want you to look at this. Look at this list of high priests that followed Annas. You got Annas from 6 to 15 AD. Then, how weird, immediately after that was his son who got the job. And then after that was Caiaphas, who happened to be Annas' son-in-law. And then after that, 36 to 37 AD was another one of Annas' sons. And then another one of Annas' sons. And another one. And another one. All the sons of Annas. Now understand, that's not the way it was supposed to work. This job was not supposed to be like a kingship that was passed down through bloodline. But Annas turned this thing into an empire. He turned it into a family business. Now, this is where it gets really wrong. Because the people would come to town with this money, and they had no idea. People at that time weren't using money. They exchanged animals. They exchanged goods. Money was not common. So they would bring this Roman money that they had gotten by selling something, and they'd bring it to the temple and say, hey, I got 3 of these. And the guy behind the counter would be like, oh yeah, that's worth like 2 of these. They were cheating the people because the people had no idea. Because they were coming to God's house. They didn't expect to get cheated at God's house. See, that's the thing about a church hurt. Anybody ever been hurt in church? See, the problem with a church hurt is you just don't expect it. You don't expect to get cheated in the house of God. You don't expect to get hurt in the house of God. And when you go to your job, you know, it may be dog eat dog. It may be every man for himself. You understand that. When you get outside of the walls, you understand that just might be the way it is. But when in church, you just don't expect to get cheated. You don't expect to get hurt. It feels like you got stabbed in the back by the people who are supposed to be on your own side. And that's why it hurts so bad. And some people never recover from it. Some people get hurt in church and they leave. And they never come back because of that hurt that came from an unexpected place. But Annas, man, this is organized crime. This is organized crime. This is the mafia. Mafiosa is what he is. Capo de capo. He is boss of bosses is what Annas is. And they were making money hand over fist. And then here comes Jesus into their little money-making scheme, flips over the table, says they're a den of thieves, basically rips the curtain back and reveals everything that they're doing and how wicked it truly is. Now, how many people ever watch any gangster movies? Yeah? Now, what happens when the good guy comes along and exposes the gangster's for the evil and the bad that they're doing in their schemes. That's where we come back to verse 18. And when the high priests heard this, they sought to destroy him. It's just like watching The Godfather, isn't it? It's just like watching The Godfather. Jesus crossed the line. He messed with the revenue stream. And they were seeking to destroy him. The other thing I want you to see is that it says in verse 18, when the high priests, plural, heard this. There was only one high priest at a time. There was only one. So why are they referring to this as if there's plural? There wasn't like a council of high priests. There was one guy at a time that was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. Interesting. But they referred to it as multiples of high priests. We'll get to that in a second. But you want further proof of who that real kind of mastermind and villain was? Annas was high priest from 6 to 8 AD till 15 AD. And he lost his job because historical record says because he had a fondness of putting people to death for breaking Jewish law. And the Jews weren't allowed to put people to death. It was against, they weren't allowed. Only the Romans could put people to death. But Annas, he kind of liked stoning people and putting them to death for breaking the law of Moses. Kind of sounds like accusing a carpenter of sedition and heresy. Anyway, and if that's not enough, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, Garden of Gethsemane, right? They drag Jesus away in shackles. They bring him. Where's the first place they take him? Do they take him to Caiaphas' house? To the Sanhedrin? Do they take him to Pontius Pilate or to Herod? They take him to Annas' house. That's the first place Jesus goes. The first person that interrogates Jesus after he's arrested is Annas. The first place that we see Jesus experience physical violence against him is in the house of Annas. It's in John, the 18th chapter. Read it. It's in verse 19. It says, and the high priest, interesting, he's not the high priest. John calls him the high priest. And people who were reading this at the time would have known that something was amiss because Caiaphas was the high priest. So why are we calling this guy the high priest? Read on. He questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him and said, it's Jesus being awesome. I've spoken openly to the world, dude. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews came together and spoke, nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who've heard what I spoke to them. They know what I've said. And when he said this, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus, saying, is that the way you talk to your high priest? Just a Goomba enforcer, right? You don't talk to the high priest that way. And then it says, Jesus answered him, if I've spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Annas was this capo, he was this boss of bosses. He was the high priest among the high priests. And he sends him to Caiaphas, who just happens to be his son-in-law. Now, here's what I want you to understand today. Did everybody kind of enjoy that? It was kind of crazy, right? All that drama going on behind the scenes of this story. But what I want you to understand tonight is that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. He was not stupid, naively going in, getting himself in a situation that he didn't understand. When he flipped over those tables and he said, you have made my father's house a den of thieves, I bet you he was making eye contact with somebody right at that moment, knowing exactly who he was talking to. He knew what hornet's nest that he was riling up. And he was making a point because Jesus, first of all, was awesome. And he knew who his enemy was. And I want to break it down for you. Annas was appointed by the Romans. They were the political power of the day. Annas represented politics. But he was also the high priest of the Jewish people. Religion. And he used that position to build an empire. Money. Politics, religion, and money. When that unholy trinity unites, you can bet that the number one thing on their jobs, things to do today list, is to destroy the Spirit of Christ and everything that he stands for. And this is why religion and church in America has at times become an abomination because we've started to believe that the way that we change people is not by changing their hearts, but by changing laws. So we've immersed ourselves in a political system, believing that that must be where the real power is. And then we've built structures and buildings and systems and put the name of church on it and really just turned it into a corporation that's only concerned with its money and its own growth at all costs, like it's on the New York City Stock Exchange. That's what we've done. We've surrendered the Spirit of Christ to politics, religion, and money, because politics seeks power. But Jesus said, he that would be master must be servant of all. And the first will be last, and the last will be first. Religion seeks control. But Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Then all these things will be added unto you. Don't take no thought what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, because you can't change one hair white or black. Why are you worrying about control when you really don't have any? And then money, of course, seeks profit at all cost. But Jesus said that you can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and money, because you're either going to hate one and love the other, or love one and hate the other. When politics, religion, and money unite, they will protect their own interest at all cost. And this is where you start to hear terms like collateral damage, acceptable loss, or hear people say things like, it is better that one man should die than a whole nation perish. Anna said that, by the way. Jesus went in and he cleaned house. He cleaned house of this unholy trinity of politics, religion, and money, because Jesus always stood up for people over position. He stood up for people over power. He stood up for people over profit. Now here's a question. Are we willing to do the same thing? Jesus, whenever he cleansed the temple, he went back to this concept of original intent. What was this intended for? This temple, it was not intended to be a place to exchange money. It was not intended to be a place to sell doves and oxen. It was meant to be a house of prayer. And if we're going to clean house in our own heart, we've got to look to the original intent. What in our life has become poisoned by a pursuit of power, a pursuit of control, and a pursuit of profit? And where have we lost sight of what's really important? The original intent. Because you can blind yourself. You can start to become convinced that your gift was meant for profit and lose the blessing that you had in using it in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't make money using your gifts. I'm not saying that. But you can lose the joy because you're so fixated on the wrong thing. How about in your relationships? When we begin to control, when we begin to try to control another human being and put structures around our relationship to try to confine it, and we lose sight of what it was that brought us together in the first place. One of my favorite scriptures, is one of my life scriptures actually, is in Luke, the 7th chapter, verse 35, where it says, Jesus turns to a group of people and he says, wisdom is justified by all her children. And basically what it means is that time eventually proves who's right and who's wrong. And wisdom will be proven right over time. You don't have to fight, you don't have to argue, because over time, stupid is as stupid does. And it proves to be stupid, and wisdom proves itself as wisdom. And the funny thing is, Jesus, he wasn't worried, because Annas and his family, they thought that they had a monopoly on what was going on. They had this perfect system. We got these booths. We got this position of power. We got the Romans figured out. We're manipulating the Romans. We got them under our thumb, under control. We know what's happening. They thought when they crucified Jesus that they'd gotten rid of another troublemaker and that everything was going to stabilize out and be just fine. But what they didn't know was that 2,000 years later, people like us would be gathering in a room and celebrating Jesus and everything that he stood for. We would be celebrating that troublemaker. And the other thing that Annas and his family didn't know was that just 40 years later, this is deep, 40 years after Jesus cleanses the temple, Annas and his sons and all of the scribes and Pharisees, would be hanging on crosses of their own outside the city of Jerusalem. The Romans finally got fed up with their petulance and their stupidity and their religiosity, and they just came in and wiped them all out and hung all of the religious leaders on crosses, lining the city coming in. What the Annas didn't know was those same Romans would tear down that temple and not leave a single stone on top of another stone. Those same Romans that they thought they had control over would sow salt in the ground so nothing would grow for 2 generations. And they would send the entire country of Israel scattered all over the world. But this little ragtag group of believers, they called Christians. It was supposed to be an insult, supposed to mean little Christ. It was supposed to make fun of us, but we wore it like a badge of honor. We listened to our master, who warned us about alliances in politics and how they'll never last. He warned us about the dangers of religion, and he warned us about using money as our measure of success. He warned us what was going to happen, and we snuck out before all this happened, and we went all over the world spreading the news of this man who stood above politics, religion, and money, and stood for people instead, and loved people so much that he sacrificed his own life to those powers of politics and religion and money, but rose again in victory to new life so that we could have new life. Wisdom is justified by all her children. You may think that you have to sit and quibble and fight over stupid things, but you don't. Live your life. Love one another. Follow the example of our master. Clean house of those things that have lost their original intent. Your hope, your faith, your love. Clean house, just like Jesus did. And get back to the core and stop fighting amongst ourselves, because it distracts us from who the real enemy is. The real enemy is the pursuit of power, the pursuit of control, and the pursuit of profit at all cost. That's what Jesus did when he cleaned house, because he knew who his enemy really was.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. We invite you to subscribe and spread the word on your favorite social media, and follow us at REN Fellowship, or keep up with us at renfellowship.com. Tune in next time as we continue to share the gospel according to common sense.